The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington Cemetery as Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The medals on his chest felt heavier than usual, each one a reminder of the battles he'd fought overseas. Today wasn't about war, though. Today was about saying goodbye to the woman who had waited for him through 3 deployments. Sarah Rodriguez had been everything to Marcus. High school sweethearts who married right after his first tour in Afghanistan, she had been the steady force that kept him grounded. While other military marriages crumbled under the weight of distance and danger, theirs had only grown stronger. She wrote him letters every single day during his deployments, sending care packages filled with homemade cookies and photos of their quiet life together. The cancer had come without warning. One day Sarah was laughing at his terrible jokes, the next she was lying in a hospital bed too weak to lift her head. The doctors said it was aggressive, that there wasn't much time. Marcus had taken emergency leave, but the Marines needed him back overseas. Sarah had insisted he go, promising she'd be there when he returned. She wasn't. Now Marcus stood outside the funeral home, watching as his fellow veterans carried Sarah's flag-draped coffin toward the waiting hearse. His hands shook slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. The other Marines present had served with him in different units over the years. They came not because they had to, but because they understood what it meant to lose someone who kept you human in an inhuman world. The funeral service had been simple, just the way Sarah would have wanted it. Marcus had spoken briefly about their love, about how she had been his anchor when the world seemed to be falling apart. He talked about her laugh, how she could make him smile even during the darkest moments of his PTSD recovery. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice, not just of soldiers, but of the families who supported them. As the procession moved toward the cemetery, Marcus felt the weight of grief pressing down on him like a physical force. He had faced enemy fire, had lost brothers in combat, but nothing had prepared him for this emptiness. Sarah had been his reason for coming home, his motivation to stay alive when everything around him was dying. The burial ceremony was conducted with full military honors. Marcus watched as the honor guard folded the American flag that had covered Sarah's coffin, their movements precise and respectful. When they handed him the triangle of fabric, he held it against his chest, feeling the last tangible connection to his wife. After the ceremony, most of the attendees slowly drifted away, offering quiet condolences and promises to check on him later. Marcus remained by the graveside, unwilling to leave Sarah alone just yet. The afternoon was growing late, and the cemetery. Workers were beginning to clean up from the day's services. Finally, Marcus knew he had to go. He placed a single white rose on the fresh earth and whispered a promise that he would visit every week. Walking back toward the parking area, he felt lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with purpose. His old truck sat alone in the nearly empty lot. Marcus climbed inside and sat for several minutes, trying to figure out what came next. The house would be empty, filled with memories and the smell of Sarah's perfume. Friends had invited him to stay with them, but he needed to face this alone, to begin learning how to exist without the person who had made existence worthwhile. As he started the engine and pulled out of the cemetery, Marcus didn't notice the police car that had been parked across the street, its occupant watching the proceedings with unusual interest. He was too lost in his own grief to pay attention to his surroundings, too overwhelmed by the finality of the day to maintain the situational awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. The drive home should have been peaceful, a chance to decompress and begin processing his loss. Instead, it would become the beginning of an encounter that would change everything, transforming a day of mourning into something much more complicated and dangerous. Officer Derek Mitchell had been having a frustrating day even before he spotted the old pickup truck leaving Arlington Cemetery. 3 domestic disturbance calls, 2 false alarms, and a mountain of paperwork had put him in a foul mood. At 28, Mitchell was still relatively new to the force, having joined the police department after washing out of the military during basic training. That failure had left him with a chip on his shoulder, especially when it came to dealing with veterans. When Marcus's truck passed by, Mitchell noticed the military stickers on the back window and the slow, careful way the vehicle was being driven. To most people, this would suggest someone who was being cautious, perhaps emotional after a difficult day. To Mitchell, it looked suspicious. He convinced himself that the driver might be impaired, though deep down he knew he was looking for a reason to make a stop. Marcus was only 3 miles from home when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Confusion washed over him as he pulled to the side of the quiet residential street. He had been driving carefully, staying under the speed limit, using his turn signals. His inspection and registration were current, his insurance valid. There was no reason for this stop. Sitting in his truck, Marcus felt his military training kick in automatically. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window. Despite his grief and exhaustion, he knew the importance of following proper procedures during a police encounter. He had been through enough traffic stops over the years to know how to handle the situation professionally. Officer Mitchell approached, the truck with his hand resting on his service weapon, his posture aggressive rather than professional. When he reached the driver's window, he immediately noticed Marcus's dress uniform and the fresh tears still visible on the veteran's face. Instead of softening his approach, something about the military bearing seemed to irritate him further. Marcus provided his license, registration, and insurance without being asked, his voice quiet but respectful as he explained that he was returning from his wife's funeral. He answered Mitchell's questions honestly, stating that he had not been drinking and was simply trying to get home safely. His military ID was clearly visible with his driver's license, showing his rank and service record. Mitchell studied the documents for longer than necessary, looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. Finding nothing wrong with the paperwork, he invented concerns about Marcus's driving, claiming that he had been swerving and driving erratically. Marcus knew this wasn't true but remained calm, asking politely what he could do to resolve the situation. The officer's behavior became increasingly hostile as the stop continued. He demanded that Marcus step out of the vehicle for field sobriety tests, despite having no legitimate reason to suspect impairment. Marcus complied, understanding that arguing would only make things worse. He performed the tests perfectly, his military conditioning making the physical aspects easy despite his emotional state. Frustrated by his inability to find any violations, Mitchell began asking increasingly personal and inappropriate questions about Marcus's military service. He made snide comments about veterans thinking they were special, about how military service didn't put anyone above the law. Marcus absorbed the verbal abuse silently, his training teaching him to de-escalate rather than respond to provocation. The situation took a dangerous turn when Mitchell ordered Marcus to place his hands behind his back. When Marcus asked why he was being arrested, having committed no crime and passed all tests, Mitchell became enraged. He interpreted the question as resistance and immediately became physical, grabbing Marcus's arm roughly and shouting commands. Marcus's PTSD, carefully managed through years of therapy, suddenly flared under the unexpected aggression. The combination of grief, exhaustion, and now physical confrontation triggered memories of combat situations. His body tensed involuntarily, a trained response that Mitchell interpreted as resistance. In that moment, a routine traffic stop transformed into something much more dangerous. Mitchell, feeling his authority challenged, reached for his taser without warning. Marcus, recognizing the threat but unable to process it quickly enough in his current state, raised his hands in a defensive gesture. The officer took this as confirmation of his suspicions and decided that force was necessary to control the situation. The quiet residential street, which had been peaceful moments before, was about to become the site of an incident that would draw attention from people Marcus had served with. People who understood the true meaning of brotherhood and would not stand by while one of their own was mistreated on the day he buried his wife. The taser struck Marcus without warning, 50,000 volts coursing through his body as he collapsed onto the asphalt. His dress uniform, the same one he had worn to honor his wife just hours earlier, became dirty and torn as he hit the ground. The electrical current locked his muscles, making it impossible to speak or move, leaving him completely vulnerable on the side of the road. Officer Mitchell stood over him, shouting commands that Marcus couldn't possibly follow, while the electricity continued to flow through his system. The veteran's body convulsed uncontrollably, his face pressed against the rough pavement, his metals scraping against the concrete. The carefully folded flag that had covered Sarah's coffin lay scattered nearby, having fallen from his truck during the struggle. Mrs. Eleanor Hampton had been watering her garden when she heard the commotion outside her home. At 73, she had lived in the quiet neighborhood for over 40 years and had never seen anything like what was unfolding on her street. Through her kitchen window, she watched in horror as a uniformed police officer stood over a man in military dress uniform, the victim clearly in distress. Without hesitation, Mrs. Hampton picked up her phone and began recording. Her hands shook as she captured the officer shouting at the motionless veteran, demanding compliance while the man was clearly unable to respond. She had lost her own husband in Vietnam and felt a deep respect for military service. What she was witnessing made her sick to her stomach. When the electrical current finally stopped, Marcus lay gasping on the ground, his nervous system struggling to regain control. Officer Mitchell immediately moved to handcuff him, yanking his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. Marcus offered no resistance, couldn't offer resistance, but Mitchell continued to treat him as a dangerous criminal rather than a grieving widower. Marcus tried to speak, to explain that he was having difficulty breathing, that his chest felt tight and painful. The words came out as whispered gasps that Mitchell ignored or chose not to hear. The veteran's face was pale, his lips beginning to show a slight blue tinge that Mrs. Hampton recognized as a sign of serious distress. Other neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the shouting and the sight of police lights. They formed a small crowd at a distance, most of them pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Several of them recognized Marcus from the neighborhood, knew that he was a veteran, knew that his wife had recently passed away from cancer. Mitchell seemed to feed off the attention, becoming more aggressive and louder in his commands. He accused Marcus of resisting arrest, though the veteran hadn't moved since hitting the ground. He threatened additional charges, claiming that Marcus had been driving under the influence despite the clean sobriety tests. The officer's behavior suggested someone who was more interested in asserting dominance than serving justice. Marcus, still struggling to breathe properly, managed to whisper a request for medical attention. His chest pain was worsening, and he was experiencing symptoms that felt similar to a panic attack but more severe. The combination of grief, PTSD triggers, and the physical trauma of being tased had pushed his body beyond its limits. Instead of calling for medical assistance, Mitchell dismissed Marcus's complaints as an attempt to avoid arrest. He forced the veteran to his feet, though Marcus's legs were still weak and unsteady from the electrical shock. The handcuffs were tight enough to cut off circulation, adding to his physical distress and making his hands begin to turn numb. Mrs. Hampton, still recording from her window, called out to the officer that the man needed medical help. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet street, but Mitchell either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her concern. Other neighbors began shouting similar observations, noting that the arrested man appeared to be in serious physical distress. The crowd was growing larger, and several people were now actively filming the encounter. Word was spreading through social media, with neighbors posting videos and asking if anyone knew what was happening to the veteran who had just buried his wife. The posts were beginning to reach people beyond the immediate neighborhood, including some who recognized Marcus from his military service. As Mitchell prepared to load Marcus into his patrol car, the veteran's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing remained labored, his skin was pale and clammy, and he was having difficulty staying conscious. What had begun as an unnecessary traffic stop had escalated into a medical emergency that the arresting officer was either unable or unwilling to recognize. Unknown to both Marcus and Officer Mitchell, the social media posts about the incident had reached several people who knew exactly who Marcus was and what he had been through. These weren't casual acquaintances or distant supporters, but Marines who had served alongside him, men who had sworn an oath to leave no one behind. They were already mobilizing, and they were not coming alone. Staff Sergeant James "Tank" Morrison was at his local VFW hall when his phone started buzzing with notifications. The 42-year-old Marine had served 2 tours with Marcus Rodriguez in Afghanistan, and they had stayed in touch over the years. Tank had been at Sarah's funeral earlier that day, had watched his brother-in-arms struggle to maintain composure while burying the love of his life. The first message Tank received was a video link from a neighbor's social media post. The caption read, "Police officer tasing veteran outside his home after wife's funeral." Tank's blood ran cold as he opened the video and immediately recognized Marcus lying on the ground in his dress uniform, the same uniform he had worn to honor Sarah just hours before. Tank didn't hesitate. Within seconds, he was on his phone, calling every Marine he knew in the area. The network activated quickly, with each call spawning 3 more. Former squad mates, Marines from other units, veterans from different branches of service, all connected by the brotherhood that transcends individual conflicts and disagreements. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos received Tank's call while she was driving home from her job at the local VA office. She had known Marcus since boot camp, had watched him grow into a leader, and had mourned with him when Sarah received her diagnosis. Without asking for details, she turned her car around and headed for the address Tank had given her. Corporal Danny Chen was at his apartment, still in his work clothes from his job as a construction foreman when his phone rang. He and Marcus had been roommates during their second deployment, had shared the small tent and the big fears that came with combat. Danny grabbed his keys and was out the door before Tank finished explaining the situation. The calls continued to spread. Active duty Marines who couldn't leave their posts immediately began working their networks, calling retired Marines, National Guard members, and veterans from other services. The message was simple. One of their own needed help, and they were going to provide it. Lieutenant Colonel, retired Patricia Williams, was having dinner with her family when she received the call. At 51, she had commanded hundreds of Marines during her career and had personally decorated Marcus for valor during a particularly difficult engagement. She excused herself from the table, kissed her husband, and explained that she had to go help one of her Marines. Within 30 minutes of Tank's first call, more than 24 veterans were converging on Marcus's neighborhood. They came from different backgrounds, different eras of service, different political beliefs. What united them was the understanding that when one Marine was in trouble, all Marines were in trouble. The code was simple: leave no one behind. Master Sergeant Robert Doc Thompson was working the night shift at the local hospital when he got the call. As a Navy corpsman who had served with Marine units, he understood the brotherhood even though he technically wasn't a Marine himself. Doc arranged for another medic to cover his shift and headed out, bringing a medical kit in case Marcus needed immediate attention. The veterans weren't coming to start trouble or to escalate the situation. They were coming to bear witness to ensure that their brother received fair treatment and to provide support if needed. Most of them were level-headed individuals with families and jobs, people who understood the importance of working within the system rather than against it. Sergeant Major, retired Frank Rodriguez, no relation to Marcus despite the shared name, had been the senior enlisted man in Marcus's unit during his final deployment. At 62, Frank had seen enough injustice in his life to know when intervention was necessary. He made several phone calls of his own, including one to a lawyer friend and another to a local news reporter who had covered veteran issues in the past. As the Marines mobilized, word of the incident was also reaching other important people. A neighbor had called the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, and the VFW commander was now aware of the situation. The American Legion post commander had also been notified, and both organizations were sending representatives to observe and document what was happening. The viral nature of social media meant that the incident was no longer contained to the immediate neighborhood. Videos of Marcus being tased were being shared across multiple platforms, with hashtags like Justice for Marcus and Armed Veterans Matter beginning to trend locally. News outlets were starting to pick up the story, and reporters were being dispatched to the scene. Officer Mitchell, still unaware of the growing attention his actions had generated, was trying to process Marcus at the scene before transporting him to the station. The veteran's condition had stabilized slightly, but he was still experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing. Several neighbors continued to call out that medical attention was needed, but Mitchell remained focused on completing his arrest. The first Marine to arrive was Tank Morrison, driving faster than he should have but staying within reason. As he pulled up to the scene, he could see Marcus in the back of the patrol car, head down, clearly in distress. Tank parked across the street and immediately began recording with his phone, while calling out to Marcus to let him know help was coming. Officer Mitchell noticed Tank's arrival and the fact that he was filming, but didn't yet understand the significance. Within the next few minutes, more vehicles would begin arriving, and the officer would realize that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The Marines were coming, and they were coming in force. The sound of car doors slamming began echoing through the quiet neighborhood as Marine after Marine arrived at the scene. They came in pickup trucks, sedans, motorcycles, and SUVs. Some were still in work uniforms. Others had changed into clothing that clearly identified their military service. All of them moved with the purposeful bearing that marked them as people accustomed to handling serious situations. Officer Mitchell looked up from his paperwork to see Tank Morrison walking toward him, phone in hand, still recording. Behind Tank, more vehicles were arriving every few minutes. The officer's confidence began to waver as he realized he was no longer dealing with a simple arrest, but had somehow become the center of unwanted attention. Tank approached the patrol car professionally, his voice calm but firm. He identified himself as a Marine veteran and asked to check on Marcus's welfare. Through the car window, he could see that his friend was pale and sweating, clearly in distress. Tank requested that Mitchell call for medical assistance, explaining that Marcus had recently lost his wife and might be experiencing a medical emergency related to stress and grief. Mitchell's response was defensive and aggressive. He ordered Tank to back away from the vehicle and threatened to arrest him for interfering with police business. Tank complied with the order but continued recording, stating clearly for the camera that he was standing on public property and observing from a legal distance. His military discipline kept him calm despite his anger at seeing Marcus's condition. More Marines continued to arrive, each one positioning themselves strategically around the scene while maintaining legal distances. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos parked near Mrs. Hampton's house and immediately began coordinating with the elderly woman, who was still filming from her window. Santos asked Mrs. Hampton to send her any video she had captured and to continue recording if possible. Corporal Danny Chen arrived with 2 other Marines from his construction crew, men who had served in different units but understood the situation immediately. They formed a loose perimeter around the scene, not to intimidate or threaten, but to ensure that everything that happened would be witnessed and documented. Their presence was professional, but unmistakable. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams arrived in a sedan with 2 other retired officers. At 51, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command, but her approach to Officer Mitchell was respectful and diplomatic. She introduced herself by rank and asked for a briefing on the situation, treating Mitchell as a professional colleague rather than an adversary. Mitchell found himself increasingly overwhelmed by the growing crowd of veterans. What had started as a simple traffic stop was now the focus of intense scrutiny from people who clearly knew how to organize and document everything that was happening. His radio chatter with dispatch became more frequent and urgent as he requested guidance on how to handle the situation. Master Sergeant Doc Thompson arrived with his medical kit and immediately asked Mitchell for permission to evaluate Marcus's condition. When the officer refused, Doc positioned himself where he could observe Marcus through the car window, noting symptoms of possible cardiac distress and calling them out loudly enough for the other Marines to hear and record. The veterans maintained strict discipline throughout their vigil. There was no shouting, no threatening behavior, no attempts to physically interfere with the arrest. Instead, they formed a wall of silent witness, their very presence sending a clear message that Marcus was not alone, and that any mistreatment would be thoroughly documented and reported. Sergeant Major Frank Rodriguez arrived with the local VFW commander and an American Legion representative. At 62, Frank had dealt with military bureaucracy and civilian authority his entire adult life. He understood how to work within systems while protecting his Marines. Frank approached Mitchell with a combination of respect and barely controlled intensity. The conversation between Frank and Mitchell was captured on multiple phones as the sergeant major calmly explained Marcus's military record and the fact that he had just buried his wife. Frank requested that medical attention be provided immediately and suggested that the arrest might be reconsidered, given the circumstances and Marcus's obvious distress. Mitchell's responses became increasingly erratic as the pressure mounted. He insisted that Marcus had been driving erratically and had resisted arrest, claims that were immediately contradicted by multiple witnesses who had observed the entire encounter. The officer's story began changing in small ways, inconsistencies that the veterans noted and documented. A news van pulled up to the scene as the story began attracting media attention. The reporter, Sandra Chen from the local NBC affiliate, had covered veteran issues before and immediately recognized the significance of the situation. She began conducting interviews with the Marines present, gathering testimony about Marcus's character and service record. The growing crowd of veterans represented multiple generations of service. There were Vietnam veterans like Frank Rodriguez standing next to Iraq War veterans, with Marines from every decade in between. Their diversity in age, race, and background was striking, but their unity of purpose was absolute. They had come to support one of their own, and they weren't leaving until justice was served. Officer Mitchell realized that his actions were being scrutinized by people who understood military law, civilian rights, and proper procedures. Every decision he made was being evaluated by individuals with extensive leadership experience and a thorough understanding of how authority should be exercised responsibly. As the standoff continued, Marcus's condition in the back of the patrol car remained precarious. The combination of grief, PTSD symptoms, physical trauma from the tasing, and the stress of being arrested was taking a visible toll on his health. The Marines could see their brother suffering, and their patience with Officer Mitchell's refusal to provide medical care was wearing thin. The arrival of Captain Robert Hayes from the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division marked the beginning of the end for Officer Mitchell's career. Captain Hayes had been monitoring the situation through dispatch and social media, watching as videos of the incident spread across multiple platforms. The department's phone lines were lighting up with calls from concerned citizens, veteran organizations, and media outlets demanding answers. Captain Hayes immediately assessed the scene, noting the professional demeanor of the assembled veterans, the clear distress of the arrestee, and Officer Mitchell's increasingly agitated behavior. As a 20-year veteran of the force and a former Army Ranger himself, Hayes understood both sides of the situation and knew that serious mistakes had been made. The captain's first priority was Marcus's medical condition. Over Mitchell's protests, Hayes called for an ambulance and ordered the veteran to be removed from the patrol car. Doc Thompson was finally allowed to approach and conduct a preliminary medical evaluation, finding elevated heart rate, signs of dehydration, and symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction. As paramedics worked to stabilize Marcus,
Captain Hayes began interviewing witnesses. Mrs. Hampton provided her video footage,
which clearly showed the entire encounter from beginning to end. The recording revealed that Marcus had been driving normally, had complied with all of Officer Mitchell's commands, and had shown no signs of impairment or resistance that would justify the use of force. The Marines present provided additional testimony, each one speaking to Marcus's character and service record. Tank Morrison described the veteran's exemplary conduct during combat operations. Lieutenant Colonel Williams testified to Marcus's leadership abilities and his clean disciplinary record. Sergeant Major Rodriguez spoke about the devastating loss of Sarah and Marcus's emotional state following the funeral. Officer Mitchell's attempts to justify his actions fell apart under scrutiny. The dashcam footage from his patrol car contradicted his claims about Marcus's driving, showing that the veteran had been traveling at legal speeds and had used proper signals. The body camera footage revealed Mitchell's aggressive behavior and his failure to de-escalate the situation appropriately. The news coverage of the incident became a major story by evening, with Sandra Chen's initial report being picked up by national outlets. The image of a grieving veteran in dress uniform being tased on the day of his wife's funeral struck a nerve with viewers across the country. Social media exploded with support for Marcus and condemnation of Officer Mitchell's actions. Within hours, the incident had attracted attention from veteran advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and political figures. The mayor's office issued a statement promising a thorough investigation. The police chief announced that Officer Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. Marcus was transported to the hospital for observation and treatment, accompanied by Doc Thompson and several of his Marine brothers. The medical evaluation revealed that while his injuries weren't life-threatening, the combination of grief, stress, and the tasing had pushed his body to dangerous limits. He would need time to recover both physically and emotionally from the ordeal. The legal ramifications for Officer Mitchell were swift and severe. The district attorney's office announced that they would not be pursuing charges against Marcus, citing the lack of evidence for any criminal wrongdoing. Instead, Mitchell himself faced potential charges including assault, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. The police department's investigation revealed that this wasn't Mitchell's first incident of inappropriate behavior. Previous complaints had been filed against him for aggressive conduct during traffic stops, particularly involving veterans and minorities. The pattern of behavior suggested deeper issues that had been overlooked or inadequately addressed by supervisory personnel. Officer Mitchell was terminated from the police force within 2 weeks of the incident. Criminal charges were filed against him, and he eventually pled guilty to assault and civil rights violations. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and prohibited from working in law enforcement. The conviction would follow him for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of how power can be abused. The Marines who had responded to support Marcus became part of a larger story about brotherhood and accountability. Their professional conduct during the crisis was praised by law enforcement officials and community leaders. They had demonstrated how to seek justice through proper channels while maintaining dignity and respect for the law. Marcus's recovery was long and difficult, but he wasn't alone. The same Marines who had come to his aid during the traffic stop continued to support him through his grief and trauma recovery. They helped him navigate the legal system, connected him with appropriate counseling services, and ensured that he had the resources needed to rebuild his life. The incident led to changes in police department policy regarding the treatment of veterans and individuals experiencing mental health crises. New training programs were implemented to help officers recognize and appropriately respond to PTSD symptoms and grief reactions. The department also established stronger oversight procedures for officers with histories of excessive force complaints. Marcus eventually became an advocate for police reform and veteran rights, using his experience to help prevent similar incidents from happening to other veterans. He established a foundation in Sarah's memory that provided support for military families dealing with loss and trauma. His story became a powerful example of how communities can come together to demand justice and accountability. The neighborhood where the incident occurred remained changed by what they had witnessed. Mrs. Hampton became a vocal advocate for police accountability, using her status as a respected community elder to push for reforms. The incident had shown ordinary citizens the power they possessed when they chose to document injustice and speak out against wrongdoing. Years later, Marcus would reflect on that terrible day as both the worst and most transformative experience of his life. He had lost Sarah and been victimized by an abusive officer, but he had also discovered the true meaning of brotherhood and the power of community solidarity. The Marines who came to his aid had honored their oath to leave no one behind, proving that some bonds transcend time, distance, and circumstance.